Да-да-да, все есть. Спасибо вам огромное. Все доброе.
Раз, два, три.
Чек-чек.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's a pleasure to see you all. And we launch our panel discussion, and the topic is government debt management and national capital market development. At first, I would like to introduce our panelists. As it goes in agenda, Alexei Korobelnikov, the chairman of the Finance Committee of the Government of St. Petersburg, Alexei Rudenko, Executive Director of Debt Capital Markets of the Gazprom Bank, joint stock company, Konstantin Vyshkovsky, Director of the Department of Public Debt and State Financial Assets of the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation, which is the host party at this forum. Olga Medvedeva, the Deputy Head of the Department of Finance and Economics of the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, and Anna Kuznetsova. She represents Moscow Stock Exchange. So public debt. Public debt is the root and the basis of financial markets in any country at all times. And on one hand, Russia has quite a good and solid situation here in the latter years through the efforts of the Ministry of Finance and all of our financial community. There has been very agile and multilateral debt market that has been established in Russia with new instruments of the debt markets. The development had been quite proactive and quite interesting. On the other hand, volatility has spiked up, and there are some issues about the further prospects of the Russian market, and probably at this panel discussion we'll be able to discuss at length what we have had in the past, what do we have right now, and what will happen to us in the future, both for the Russian regions and the Russian Federation in general. So first of all, I would like to hear Konstantin and his vision of what's going on today with the public debt, and where are we going to go into the future when it comes to the government debt, and how the market is going to evolve, because it is closely connected to the internal as well as external sovereign bonds markets. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Well, the latest events and the latest news, mostly those who come from overseas, they absolutely have a serious impact on the domestic market situation. It's obvious that it would not be untrue if we would say that the sanction rhetorics and potential sanctions for the public debt of Russia will have not a negative impact on our market, and will not make things even more complex in terms of the issuers attracting borrowed funds. First of all, at the domestic market. A negative impact actually happens. We all see that the market participants are nervous. We can see market anxiety related to yet another news on the planned imposition of sanctions on Russian government debt, but also along with that, we believe that there are no serious grounds for panic. We have always been saying that despite the share of the non-residents in Russia is quite significant, even with the worst-case scenario, when most of them, due to sanctions imposed on the public debt, will not be possible to buy our debt instruments, still we do not envision and we do not see it as the foundation to believe that the domestic market of public debt will cease, will stop, and that we will not be able to run our programs of borrowing in the volumes that we are planning to do it in. On a number of occasions, we have stated again and again that the main class of investors on the Russian market, as you may be well aware, are Russian banks and Russian market participants in the years to come. There are no reasons to believe, even in case that there will be some limitations or ban imposed on buying Russian debt by, let's say, American investors or international investors. Again, there is no reason to believe that the Russian market players will not be able to replace non-residents. And the main factor which gives us such assurance is the forecasted banking liquidity surplus, the factor that we always named as a key factor for the proactive involvement of the Russian banks on the market. You may know that when, in the last year, we've boosted up the volume of borrowings, we've had the same questions of who is going to buy these. But not only we were able to fully implement our borrowings program, but we've done it without any sensitive or any increase of the cost of attraction of funds, or cutting down duration of our debt. Couple more considerations, if you will, about the share of non-residents. Of course, it is decreasing. If by the mid-year in June we had peak numbers about the share of the non-residents in the area of 34%. Today it is estimated by the Central Bank of Russia on the level of 26–27%. We can see the drastic drop. It does not mean, however, that we need to do the mass sales of our securities for such a drop. For some investors, it's enough not to boost their investments with the same rate or not to do it at all, as it had been the case prior to that. We do not expect any further tangible shrinkage of this share. If such shrinkage may happen, it will be very insignificant, or this share will stabilize at the current numbers. And basically we can assert that the trend of watering down of the share of the residents has a positive meaning and impact on the market. You may remember that prior to all this sanctions story and hype, when the share of non-residents had been growing very rapidly, by many market participants and analysts had been raising questions. Is that a concern for the Ministry of Finance and for the Russian regulators, namely the Central Bank of Russia? It's a fact that quite a big share of non-residents on the market is also a risk factor. And now, due to the very well-known circumstances, we can see some decrease of this share, but it's still quite significant. I am sorry for this disturbance. I have some issues with putting my phone on a silent mode. One more important circumstance I would like to draw your attention to. I'm still speaking about the maintaining share of non-residents on the Russian market. As you may know, that speaking of its fundamental indicators, macroeconomic indicators, such sovereign issuer as Russia, with a ratio debt to GDP on such a low level, and Russia who has 2 or 3 investment ratings, which have been ascribed by the international rating agencies. If we're speaking about emerging countries on the market, you simply cannot find any other examples like that in Russia. So fundamentally speaking, our market and the Russian sovereign risk is still very attractive for investors. With the rate of return that they get on the Russian market, I doubt that they'll be able to get this kind of revenues or yield on the other markets, given the risk and return correlation, unless there'll be some global disruptions or circumstances which may make it impossible for the foreigners to buy our debt. We are convinced that a significant share of the non-residents will maintain on the Russian market. As for borrowing plans, in the current year, are we going to reconsider our borrowings programs? Are we going to fully utilize it 100%, or do we need to do it at all? I would like to cite a couple numbers to illustrate my point. Based on the outcomes of the 7 months of the current year, the surplus of the Russian budget, if you evaluate it in the terms of the percentage from GDP, is 2.5%. At the same time, in 2018, the volume of settlements for the Russian public debt is 1% of the GDP. So this budget surplus that we have today has actually overlapped the volumes needed for volumes of attraction of funds needed to pay out our current obligations in the current year. As of today, the volume of the net attraction is about 370 billion rubles. The volume of the debt, outstanding debt, before the end of the year is absolutely negligible, about 1 billion. These numbers do confirm the lack of need for the Ministry of Finance of Russia to carry on 100% its program of borrowings to avoid any situations or financial gaps or potential situations when technically it would not be capable to provide liquidity to fulfill its debt obligations, which, by the way, is not specific for the many countries of the developing world which cannot afford not to borrow regularly, let's say on a weekly basis, and are under the threat of financial gap situation. So we are going to stay with the Russian market, to be on the Russian market. We'll do it very carefully. We are going to avoid, and we do not pursue any goal of putting pressure on the primary market. Of course, in a situation when the revenue part is growing due to some unfavorable external factors, which basically means that the market is dominated by the sellers of our securities. Any additional supply by an issuer has a negative impact on the market ratings. We aren't going to do that. And the auction that is taking place this week, despite overall quite tense situation, first we made a decision to try to carry out this auction by offering a limited amount of new securities. We've done it based on a conventional studies of market opinion. On Tuesday, when decisions are made about issuance or non-issuance, market participants were more inclined towards issuing securities in this volume by Ministry of Finance, but since the announcement was made, since the publication of our release about the placements on Wednesday, and prior to doing this auction on Wednesday, new circumstances presented themselves which have had a negative impact on the market players. The yields Wednesday morning have grown up quite strongly, and the demand which had been demonstrated by the market players has significantly outpaced the volume of supply. And the prices, as they have been specified in a bid, they would imply additional premiums and the yield premium. And in this case, we've made a decision that it would be expedient to say that the auction has not taken place. It was not valid because we're not willing to sell at the current prices. In the future, we're going to take as balanced and as careful approach, looking at the market situation and avoid unnecessary pressure on the ratings of our debt instruments. And I will reiterate as for the quarter number 4. The borrowings program is going to be carried out in the volumes which do not imply any pressure on the yield curve. And if the situation on the market will enable us to attract resources, we will be doing that. There is an opinion, however, that maybe right now we have to make a stand that the Ministry of Finance is freezing any auctions. We do not envision any need to do that. We're going to follow the market moods and situations. We do have here reps of the Russian banking community. They are members of our auctions, and they know that we are staying in close contact with the market community. And in this current situation, we are going to be ever more careful and watchful. Thank you. I guess my next question is to Anna Vasilyeva. 2 questions in one, actually. Number 1, how has the current situation impacted the markets and actions at the Moscow Stock Exchange? And secondly, as a part of all the discussions and sanction packages imposed, do you discuss vulnerabilities of the securities market, let's say from the international infrastructure? Because old-timers, they do remember for the fight for the market liberalization in 2013. There was a ceremony of us joining to the settlement systems and the full liberalization, and now it's quite the opposite. It has become the additional risk factor. And my question is, what is being done to ensure the seamless functioning of the stock exchange in any geopolitical situation? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for interesting questions. We, as a stock exchange, is basically the mirror of the political and economical processes. It's difficult to say something alternative because from what Konstantin has mentioned, and I would like to expand a little bit on what he has touched upon. First of all, if we look at the situation of 2018, the public debt has grown by 5.5%. I'm speaking about the volume of the bonds issued throughout this year in the 8 months of the current year versus 8 months of 2017. In the last 10 years, public debt has been growing with a rate 15% a year. Just to give an idea, the corporate debt this year is 4.3%, in the last 10 years 19%. Who are the buyers? As it has been rightfully pointed out, the main buyers are the Russian Bank of Russia. I remember after 2012 liberalization of the public debt market and the maximum share in the volume of secondary trading, which would be accounted for the Bank of Russia, there was 65%. Now the share of the Russian banks of public debt trading is 53–55% throughout 2017. The second largest investor in this market would be indeed non-residents. As Konstantin mentioned, their share today is about 27%, and the share in secondary trading in 2018 amounted to 36–38%. By the end of the last year, it was 36%. So pension funds have joined the market, and first the volume of money increased in the pension system, in the pension funds, and the volume of money invested in the bonds, corporate and government bond, in the last 3 years increased in 3.5 times in amount.
For the Russian market is 1.7 trillion ruble. we can see pretty much the same situation with investors and individual and their attitude towards securities. According to Eurostat, over the past 5 years, their savings have increased by 5%, and the number of securities in portfolio has increased by 2.6 times and now amounts to 5.6 trillion rubles. As a result, the interest of individual for securities markets is really visible, starting from shares up to corporate bonds, and this government debt there is ranked #1 amongst all the position. Well, first of all, the Ministry of Finance over the past 3 years, I think, created a lot of economic stimulus in order to take a different look at investments. We can talk about individual investment accounts and also higher investment fees and also return of the pensions for privileged property and also equalizing of taxation for bonds and deposit. And the very last measure that was taken, cancellation of different currency for European bonds. I think that that is enough for the population to start comparing them with bonds and very important bonds like high-rating bonds and state bonds. Second thing, I think, played a very important role in involving the involving population is the action taken by the Ministry of Finance last year and the offers that in place last year. So we got 1.8 billion ruble that were invested by the population. We received 33 and 5 new investments, so they were attracted, and there was 60% of new ones amongst them. Even more important, right after the investments and population get some securities, so they also get government debts or part of that, and also state bonds. The most important thing of it is that we have 2 major banks who were selling those bonds, so they managed to use their deposit branch in order to sell securities. As a result, we saw that both those banks and other leading banks, approximately 7 or 10 banks, they accomplished such issues for the population, so they decided to preserve their investment base for the actions for the populations. And usually after first such transactions, they are inevitably accompanied by next ones. And in this case, the involvement of the population is really tremendous, even though in 2017 the population was not that active in buying FZN, and they preferred secondary circulation securities instead of those ones. And I think still that I would like to thank, just like other brokers, to thank Ministry of Finance. So the population participated in placement last year, and actually the total figure amounted to 2.4%. So the involvement this year can be estimated at 7.8%. So we can say that the total amount of bonds amounted to 30 million obligations, which accounts for 12% of all the bonds that are now being circulated within the stock exchange. That is it with the first question. So approximately 10-12 issuance of all the issuance. This is something that population participate in, and I should say that actually all the categories of different investments can meet within the stock exchange. The second question is can be answered in the following way. So our infrastructure today is absolutely transparent. I think that in the current situation, we should really fulfill our roles at a very high quality level. That's exactly what we're doing right now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And since we are proceeded to the issue of borrowing amongst population, then the question is for Olga, as the representative of the region, who is an active representative at the sub-federal debt market, and also is involved in the issue of borrowing, and probably can share some of the impressions from that matter, and also share some of the expertise and experience and as well as advantages. regarding that market. Thank you very much. On the 8th of October, it will be years since the bonds have been in circulation in the market. Well, actually, we assess this process very positively, thanks to the infrastructure that we established and our work with the Ministry of Finance and banks. We managed to sell the whole scope of bonds within 1 day, but at the same time, demand was 1.5 higher than the supply. Considering that, we even had to resort to allocation, so managed that we decreased the number of requests from individuals. It also allowed to partially really bring the issuance of bonds closer to the market requirements. The negative things, well, I don't see any, because it allowed us to involve the population in the process and investors, and it proves once again that our population does really trust the governor, and it's very positive moments. Even more important, people really had the courage to buy bonds, even though that from the very beginning they did not know much about that. It's kind of expanding that space of trust, and also to make them more confident in that kind of tool. And now I would like to address this issue to Alexei. What do you think from the point of view of the bank directly involved in the placement of all the bonds for within the territory? How competitive such bonds could be for the population? Of course, it is obvious that Russian investors have always been really greedy and impatient. So those who buy up those bonds, they should restrain those feelings, and they don't want. Nobody wants to pay the interest right now on them. But at the same time, bonds, they are not short-term securities, so this, of course, it's a long-term investment. So what about the balance of those interests? How can we make it really competitive? Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for such an opportunity to speak here. I hope that today we have different representatives from various Russian entities. These are exactly the people that we are working for. When we first set our goals and wanted to issue bonds, we wanted to meet three following requirements. First of all, we wanted to create an instrument that would be really convenient for the federal investor. That is why we decided to use the central base, make it more stock exchange nature, and also work in cooperation with the stock exchange. This allowed us not to put too much load on some unnecessary questions for it, and also allow them to use ordinary infrastructure with all the conventional means. And then we also wanted to create mechanism that would allow Russian entities to borrow funds at a competitive price. Here the task was more complicated, and I would segregate that task into a number of stages. So the first stage is about instruments. Again, here we used the experience of the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. That experience has already turned to be a success, and of course it can be used within the federal segment, generating very positive results. So we issued, created bonds without any price fluctuation risks. Of course, that was step number one that allowed us to work with a wider range of physical entities or individuals. Just like according to the stock exchange, we are becoming more and more active. We have different stock exchange tools. So we talk about that part of the population who are aware of the risk of the price fluctuations, of the market risk, etc. They are focused more on the populations who are not specialists yet in that domain. So they wanted to attract more people into that. As a result, when we eliminate price fluctuation related risk, then the situation gets better. The problem is that when we don't have an opportunity to earn against any lack of any price fluctuations, we want to offer some kind of a premium or bonus so that we can start working with this very part of population. We have seen quite a number of tools that are placed without any secondary circulation, including state bank bonds. Those offers were very active, and we noticed that, judging on the conjuncture, the attitude towards price really varies. I mean to say that when the market is conditions are really good and the difference between deposit interest rates is not that big, just like state borrow bonds that are circulated in the market, and also borrows, corporate borrows, of course. In this situation, we want, on one hand, to stimulate or motivate investors to show some potential bonus on top of the interest rates that we already have within stock exchange. By doing that, we would like to invest even more of them. By the way, we also right now in a situation that destroys that stereotypes that we used to have, which is that bond state bond is always more expensive than the conventional one. So when the spread between the deposit rates, interest rates, and the rates that are now used to trade some products by the federal level and the state, etc., it's a little bit more higher than it probably could be. And right now it amounts to 7%. Usually it's like 6 or something. State bonds, I mean long-term bonds, has already exceeded 9%, exceeded the threshold of 8.9%. In this situation, it is reasonable to ask why would we need to give any other time for the bonds that we already have some kind of a storage within the market, and it already has some premium within the markets compared to deposit. So we have a situation where the deposit interest rates, they are more inert than the previous ones. So if somebody works with this market on a regular basis and also has an opportunity to offer some of those bonds in the market, then of course they can find some ways to attract population on more attractive conditions than, for example, the open market, where there are a lot of operating investors. The key goal of the obligations for population today, and a lot has been said about that in the previous session. Yes, we said that we need to develop the economy, but of course I just wanted to put it in a more simple terms and say that we need to invite the population to get it involved in the finance system, etc. Right now the population have more cash in their hands than the total amount of capitalization. There is something to compete for.
Thank you. Maybe next question to Alexei Alexeyevich, because St. Petersburg is very active in attracting funds and doing investment programs separately for population. As far as I know, you do not do anything in this regard, but on the other hand, you have very proactive financing of different kinds of projects. Maybe you could share your experience and tell why are you avoiding the population, because it's a rich region where you're living in. You have your own potential target audience among your own population, but maybe some factors mentioned prior to that resulted in the sense that you do not want to borrow money from the population. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. That's true. We looked at the experience of other regions of Russia for placing bonds for population, but we were not convinced that on the level of region we need that. I'll explain why. First of all, we have to see what kind of goals we pursue when placing this kind of bonds. I'm convinced that bonds for population as the instruments, it's a very interesting instrument. And of course, it is aimed at developing financial market. But developing a financial market is not the original goal. It's a goal of Ministry of Finance of Russia. And in this regard, this tool is being promoted and being issued by the Ministry of Finance. We think it is right, it's timely, and we do believe that this experience and practice has to be proliferated and scaled up. Also, on the level of the Russian region, we basically do not have this goal. Probably we have to look for any other reasons of why do we need to utilize this instrument. In some other constituent entities of Russia, they do find this kind of reasons. They say it's like a litmus test of trust to a local government by population. And they say that we need to attract money from the general populations. We have to take them out from their little piggy banks, which is a reasonable thing. And they say that we have to enhance the people's financial literacy. Yes, to some extent, although I am convinced that here we have to understand what is of primary and secondary importance. We believe that financial literacy has to be improved by different means. First, we have to create those tools and instruments and infrastructure. We have to teach people of how to work with these financial instruments, and after that, people will start buying them. And there is no need to sell these financial instruments, so the people would take a try and see, okay, this is convenient, and in this way increase their financial literacy. We believe that this sequence of actions, quite versa, it has some risks related to the fact that people are not literate, financially speaking, if they are using this kind of risk-free instrument. There is no secondary circulation of these bonds, and the state is guaranteeing a full return of the body of the loan. People may be pulled into more risky instruments and may have sustained heavy losses, the money that they were counting to return. So we think that on the level of a Russian region, of course, everybody is deciding whether they need it or not. But as for ourselves, we have realized that we are going to abstain from this kind of bonds, popular bonds or population bonds, whatever you call them, less it has quite a big scale and quite a big effect, because the scale of issue is quite big. But if you issue securities quite big for a population, this in turn creates certain risks of sustainability for the local budget, because it makes clear that these issues are more expensive to operate, and they also have risks of preliminary return. If a population, for whatever reasons, people may think that I would like to get my money back, and all of these bonds, they do have the options of the early withdrawal of funds. We, as the main instrument for financing the public deficit, of course, we do not consider this kind of instrument. At the same time, we do think as a main instrument borrowings on the market. In the structure of our government debt, we have 14% only accounted for the budget loans from the Ministry of Finance, taken back in 2015, when such a window of opportunity was still existing. By the end of the year, we're going to pay off fully those budget loans. We're going to use market instruments, and bonds traditionally have been used as a financial instrument for over 20 years. We know how to work with bonds. We have a professional team, and inside the city's government, we are always attracting market professionals to this. And in the last year, we've quite successfully worked with 3 major banks, VTB, Gazprom Bank, and Sberbank of Russia, who have helped us to make our placements. And I believe that this practice will be continued into the future. And nevertheless, we are speaking primarily about issues of bonds for corporate sector. of Russia. Today we've heard it, that there is a less probability that the foreign investors are going to invest into the Russian bonds, but in reality, in the last year, we can see that foreigners are not keen to buy our bonds. The Chinese have bought a lot of our bonds, but I think their interest will be maintained, and these type of investments are going to continue, but mostly these are investments by the Russian corporate sector. And in this regard, we believe that the demand for bonds, especially for such regions as St. Petersburg, with a credit rating on the level of credit rating of the Russian Federation. So for obvious reasons, the yield is higher than the federal loan bonds. So I believe that the interest of investors for our market will persist. But given the macroeconomic parameters, yes, of course, it is up to us to take a very careful look, especially at the end of this year, to the strategy of borrowing by the time frames, by the instruments, to be able to optimize and to create a certain portfolio, borrowing portfolio, which would enable us not to overpay for services, but at the same time fully meet the needs of the market in debt financing. This kind of need we can see this year. It will be the case in the following years. And we're always asked, so you are increasing debt. We do, beginning with the last year, we are enhancing or increasing our debts. Whether it creates certain risks for the city's budget, do you think that this is the dead end? We do not think it's a dead end, because those borrowings we are making, we make them quite substantially and reasonably, knowing that we are not simply wasting away this money, but we are using them for development. All the more that the president has set a quite ambitious challenge and goal. It's his presidential decree about the breakthrough social and economic development. And for us not to spin our wheels but to go forward, we need quite big investments, which would not be possible to do simply using our own resources. Moscow can be an exception, but all other regions of Russia, in one way or another, they will need help from the federal budget, because we have the budget, surplus budget available. The Ministry of Finance, if it gets any additional transfers, for obvious reasons, they do not consider us. So we are hoping that all of our projects, development projects, and I'm speaking not only about the development as an investment into the fixed assets. Let's take a bigger look. This is an investment into the human capital, and this is the development of the healthcare and the educational system. It all requires quite big investments. So we are going to attract debt financing, I would say in reasonable scale and scope, not to disbalance the budget. But the volumes which we are attracting, we believe that they are quite, again, smart, reasonable. They would not result in any disbalances. Thank you. And as we are speaking about the development of investment plans and the new toolbox, maybe my question is to Konstantin about public guarantees, state guarantees, and changes in the attitude of the Ministry of Finance to this tool and how to develop in the future. Because we know that these plans and what yesterday and today was mentioned by the ministry and by other officials, that still the main emphasis will be not on the budgetary funds but on attracting private funds. In my opinion, you cannot do it without a guarantee. Thank you. At first, before engaging into the topic of guarantees, I will allow just one more consideration about the involvement of general population. For the second consecutive year, we have been implementing this project, and we've heard some positive evaluation of the project. We do believe that this instrument is available, it's alive. But based on the results of this period, we have also seen that the mechanisms which we've selected require some correction and modification. And this is in our nearest plans, because indeed the number, about 15 billion rubles, which we have attracted through this instrument, we do not consider it enough, although we have never considered this tool as a tool of the fiscal policies. We've never pursued fiscal goals. We simply wanted to do our borrowings program, and this is truly exclusively the instruments of developing financial literacy. It's one of the measures the state is using the whole range of tools to develop population's financial literacy. There was a statement here that first you need to teach citizens and then to offer them this kind of instruments. But to be honest, I do not know how to teach a citizen unless we do it just like that. When you offer an investment vehicle or instrument, which is still today is a quasi-market instrument, it carries within it some limited risks, but still it does carry risks. And knowing the most important parameters from the notions and definitions, what is income, what is price, and how, through what factors can you change these parameters. It is very important for people to understand, for those people who are not professional market players, for those who do not have enough knowledge. It's important to them to get just a basic understanding. They should have it. And if anybody wants to get additional yield, you want to make more money outside of your profession, if the market situation will be favorable. We're speaking about the federal loan bonds. We're speaking about the bonds, classic Russian federal loan bonds. And if a citizen believes that he or she is ready, they understand no bans, no prohibitions on owning federal loan bonds by physical persons. We do not have it in country. We do welcome initiatives by the Russian regions as they are open in issuing this kind of instruments. I would totally agree with Evgeny that this is the question of financial literacy. It's a prerogative of the Ministry of Finance, not one particular entity of Russia. Of course, the regions are looking at this tool mostly as the tool of borrowings. This is the most expensive instrument for us, and this level of revenue which it provides to the citizen exceeds revenue which you can get for a bank and deposit stuff. We're saying that this is the most interesting one, and to get we have the weekly sessions when we approve the yield. Last year, we almost approached 9% for the next week in terms of our projected revenue. No bank, if you just put money on the bank, will give you this kind of yield, 9% per annum. It's not going to happen. We, in the nearest future, are working very proactively to modify the mechanisms of this instrument's placement. We are speaking and planning to increase the number of agents. Important change is alleviating citizens from paying commission to banks if they do any operations with these securities. Now we will shift this responsibility on our own agency. We're going to pay the fees and commissions to the agent banks ourselves. And when people come to the bank agent buying our instruments, will not be paying any commissions. We're hoping to make it more attractive, these instruments. And also, another goal, which is more strategic, we're trying to pursue right now. It's not a question of several months. Is creating an opportunity of buying this kind of instruments remotely and online, that you can use it. They're well aware. Marketplace, people are seeing, we're hearing this. We are trying to do that, and we believe that simplification of the procedure of buying, which is very important goal that has to be solved. And we are hoping that jointly with the Central Bank of Russia, with the stock exchange and other colleagues, we will be able to do that in the near future. And I also wanted to point out about St. Petersburg. I believe that the budget credit in the structure of the debt of such an issuer of St. Petersburg is really not quite a logical word combination. So the Russian Federation has prematurely early paid its external debt. What I'm trying to say that if you have in the structure of the debt budget credit, it should be considered as a factor, as yet another testimony that the issuer, maybe in their past, but they had some issues with attracting market resources since they tapped into the pocket of population. It should not be very decent, and I remember that Russia gave up, or Russia done everything to get rid in its debt structure, to get rid from the debt to the Paris Club, which was another confirmation and testimony of some problems we've had in the past with servicing our debt obligations. So as the Federation, such regions as St. Petersburg and Moscow, to ask money from population would be completely wrong. Vladimir, we were using those opportunities which had been existing at the moment in time, and we gave up restructuring these loans, although we've had this opportunity provided to us by the Ministry of Finance. But I'm speaking in generally. I would agree with you that these kind of instruments are probably the donor regions should not be using them unless that uncertainty which has been existing in the several last years, including intra-budgetary relations and tax policy. You know that there are very serious changes are taking place, which is also places some pressure on regional budgets. And here we, as those who are proponents of the minimizing debt servicing, and we're using the budget credits, although for us this window of opportunity is closed now. And I'm representing the bloc which is not responsible for inter-budgetary relations, and we are propagating, I believe, more right attitude to the instruments of the budget credit. This should be considered as the tool of the state support during the crisis, but not as the instruments of the cheap financing and financing also of the rich regions. If we're speaking about the foreign investors who, for some reason, are not keen and eager to buy sub-federal loans, but if I were a foreign investor and I could see in the structure of your debt some debts for the loans and credits, I would ask you during the roadshow, why do you have such debts? It's a global experience. It's a normal relations. An issuer has to have an ongoing access to the market sources of the borrowed funds. That's why we need to develop the debt market and to maintain this market, even when there is no need. There is no need to attract these resources to implement development projects. And this is why the key challenge of the debt policy of the Russian Federation is developing national market. This is why we are trying to stay on international capital markets, although in terms of practical value or fiscal need, there is no need to borrow in foreign currency, but still we are doing that, and we are encouraging the constituent entities to follow our lead. The market of the sub-federal loan have to be maintained, supported. We have to work with investors. We got to get our ratings, and then in case of more complex market situations, there won't be no need to go and ask for the budget credit.
Антон Германович.
Anton said today that we are going to ensure a certain level of stability for forthcoming years, just like for business. The only thing we can do is to hope. We very much rely on that, and we absolutely agree with every single word from the economic point of view. It is really substantiated. But I would like to ask you with counter request, could you introduce some spot checks within the budget revision, because when we use this window of opportunities, even though that we don't have such a cash-related needs, when we try to do it on paper, even though that is not required to finance some budget deficit, inevitably we have question on part of the law enforcement agencies, which is like, for example, I mean, also accounting chamber, etc. Why are you actually involved in this kind of activities? Why do you take on some additional expenses to serve that debt, even though that there is no acute need for that? And when we try to explain that we wanted to maintain interest for our securities, when we wanted to support somehow the financial market, it's not taken as an argument, because we are not authorized to do that. At least regions are not authorized to do that, not supposed to do. Probably we need to do it at the legislative level to make it more official. We have two directions there. The first one is to organize webinars, the Stock Exchange Moscow School, which is about choosing the right broker, and dividend trading. And also we organize banking literacy fairs. The first one is scheduled for the period 21st, 23rd September, and by the way, the Ministry of Finance is presented there. We have similar events in St. Petersburg. Would be great if the Committee of Finance of the St. Petersburg would get involved in that in order to improve banking literacy. And of course you are most welcome to participate in that kind of fairs. Absolutely. Konstantin previously formulated a thesis who said that this falls within the scope of the Ministry of Finance, and anyway we try to do the same thing with all the events organized by the Ministry of Finance as well as other establishments. I think that this is a very important task, even in a broader context. I mean, a budget literacy and tax literacy, or awareness, I would say, that for different categories of the population, both for entrepreneurs and ordinary people. And we exactly are doing that at our level, and we would like to proceed in that way further on. We are very much thankful for such an opportunity, and we definitely take advantage of it. Okay, let's go back to state guarantees, and after that we will have some time for a Q&A session. So in case you have ideas, you have some time now to ponder upon them. I will try to be as brief as possible with my remark. I am going to talk about a very specific subject. Probably it is not really fits in our today's discussion, considering our panelists, etc. We found it necessary to say a few words about it, not from the point of view of a kind of request for the regions to actively use these instruments. No, it's about a different thing. The point is that for Russia as well as for the federal budget, state guarantee tool or state assistant mechanism has gained particular importance, and it became one of the most important tools for the anti-crisis assistance for enterprises. Yes, it manifested itself during the last economic crisis of 2010. The state really managed to build up the scope of provided guarantees, and as of today, I'd like to remind you, yes, state guarantees, according to our practice, according to the Russian practice, we have their part of the state debt, and it's not reflected as some kind of off-balance obligations, but it's included in that government debt, and also methods of the state pressure. So right now it accounts for 17% of the state guarantee, I mean of the government debt. It amounts to over 3 trillion ruble, a very considerable sum of money, and in certain circumstances they can represent certain risks. So it means that we should consider state guarantees as one of financial stability factors. Worth mentioning that despite very active use of this tool during the crisis, and also a big number of granted guarantees, the number of occurrence of cases that fall that are covered by the guarantee, the number of cases when payments were actually made a very insignificant sum of money and did not exceed even 10 billion ruble. And we think that this is one of the things that again demonstrate our attitude towards the risks, our monitoring system that are covered by the guarantee. So, following the results and accumulated experience, I would like to, and probably this is not the right platform for doing that, but I would like to outline our main principles and main vision as to how guarantees related support should be provided by the state. It's important to talk about that due to the reason that the Minister of Finance over the past time has been quite active and was really heavily criticized by the banking society and other industrial ministers because they accuse us of being pursuing very strict policy in the sphere of guarantees. They say that it's very difficult to get a guarantee and that requirements that are put forward by the Minister of Finance regarding the evaluations, etc., in order to identify cases that fall within the guarantee coverage and the need for execution of certain obligations or the so-called regressive requirements that arise for the grantor in case they fail to comply with the state guarantee. So they find these conditions very strict, and it make the state guarantee less important. I would like to use some thesis and to go through a list of the same principles that we find to be an absolutely must when it comes to the guarantee support related policy. I would like to start by saying that state guarantees should not be regarded as a massive tool of support. When I say massive, it means massive retail products. There are other projects and products other than that. If you want to support the export industry, so apart the so-called export state export guarantees, we also have some insurance products that are offered by our national institute, XR. There they cover different retail stuff, standardized products. In this vein, the insurance products to support export and export guarantees are not competitors, but they just replenish each other. This instrument of support of a national scale, large scale, for enterprises that work within the key strategically important economic industries, including those that were exposed to temporary. And I would like to highlight this word once again. Yes, temporary difficulties with borrowing, and also that volatility that we are seeing right now in the market, and also some unfavorable macroeconomic situation. So provision of state guarantees should be done in line with the state of the financial condition of the enterprise. It shouldn't be just a tool of assistance for enterprise that is about to go bankrupt or at a pre-bankruptcy stage. It doesn't mean that government assistance shouldn't be provided in such situation. No, it means that we are supposed to use other tools in such situations, and we need to use some kind of assistance or rather than guarantees in such situations. Who will force the players to completely fulfill their obligations. They also make the funds of borrowing more available, even when it comes to large-scale projects. So those banks that act as beneficiaries under state guarantees. So upon receipt of such a guarantee, they can assess or evaluate the cost of the granted resource, and they also diminish credit risks, make those sources more available for everybody. The provision of the government that cover 100% of all the cases should be examined and then, if needed, taken just as an example. But there should be segregation, and guarantee should not cover 100% of the credit. We need to reinforce the responsibility-related measures, and also those that fall within the bank and beneficiary, and those that are credits and a part of the crediting policy. We find it necessary to, again, based on those principles and requirements, we find it important to amend a little bit the legislative part, and also that's the one that is directly linked to the guarantee clauses. And we want really the banking community to join our discussion. We want to understand that the provision of the banking guarantees is, and as well as state guarantees, something that is not done for free. So when we talk about those fees and also the cost, we understand that this is outstanding issue. So far, no decision has been made, but we find it important to relaunch our discussion, down-to-earth discussion of, and we really have to discuss all those principles. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive answer. So you outline your position. I think that now we need to. Now that we have those basic topics, we can proceed to a more full-fledged discussion. Now it's time to proceed to our Q&A session. Do you have any questions? And please introduce yourself. Good afternoon. My name is Alexander, and I have a question for Konstantin Vyshkovsky. The panel is called Government Debt Management. Yesterday, we heard that there is one more tool that can be used to manage government debt. And Mr. Kolchev said that in case of extreme stress, the Ministry of Finance and central banks can analyze and look into a possibility to use some tools to manage the debt. So what do you mean by saying this extreme stress, and is the infrastructure ready to tackle that issue? Thank you very much, Alexander. Again, I will try to answer that question using certain thesis. Such tool is not being used now. It hasn't been previously used. Theoretically, it could be used from my perspective. And of course, here we talk about the actions taken by the central bank. So there it can be used. We are talking about situations where we have a very abrupt volatility. We're not talking about this tool to be used on a regular basis. It's not a part of the system of borrowing. This is just a single use tool. So we're talking about just single or spot uses. Again, it is done against the background of an excessive volatility that might happen within the market from time to time. As for the Ministry of Finance, so far they haven't made any such plans. You ask us about also about the infrastructure, whether it's ready or not. But as for at least tools and normative bans or some budget allocations, I would say there is none. That is why I think that it could be one of the tools for the central bank to answer those questions and also to react to some excessive volatility fluctuations and also some external factors. Thank you very much. Gazprombank, Anton. I also have a question for Konstantin. Well, actually, I would like to say whether you are thinking about a flexible approach to duration, at least at the initial stages, considering that usually the devil is in the long-term perspective and perhaps later on paperwork basis. So have you thought or considered a possibility not to completely reject it, but to step into the market with a more short-term securities? I have already said today, and I would like to reiterate that every time we enter the market and every auction bid is preceded by a certain work done together with the market players. We offer those instruments that, according to the opinion of the market players, is in the biggest demand. We have a certain portfolio with various instruments of different duration. So, and we pick the right one based on our discussions that occur within our circles between us and the market players. These are not two different things. They are not torn apart. We just don't do some spot checks and choose them quite by incident. No, we, for example, we might have one duration today and another tomorrow, but when we see a certain demand on part of the market players, then we do some analysis and pick the right tools that then offered the auction bid, and we are really willing and ready to listen to you as one of the participants and players of the market. We are open for offers and for your suggestions. We also had raised hand in the center. I have a question for Konstantin. Could you please extrapolate a little bit on the Ministry of Finance and its approach and how they're ready for this kind of policy? As far as I know, that document actually circulated 3 times, but are you going to proceed to some regular publications? And what about middle-term strategies, judging from the international practice?
And also, do you monitor risks, regular risks in this document? The document is for a 3-year period. We are assuming that, yes, it's a public document. It's been uploaded on our website, and both in Russian and in English. And we are assuming that the document has to cover, that is to be relevant in any point of time. If it is for 3 years, it does not mean that it has to be updated every year. We do that if we see that for any points, for any bullets, it's not relevant anymore. So in this case, we are attempting to actualize this document, because you said that this document has been prepared in different time frames. But in any moment of time, based on this document, you can understand that for the current period of time, what are the plans, what are the main approaches employed by the Ministry of Finance as the issuer, what kind of the guiding principles that were guided by when we do the borrowing and lending policies. If you have any comments, any considerations, we'll be very grateful. If you have something to say about the document, we will be happy to hear of what still has to be reflected in this document. And then, by the way, you know that we are planning to make it mandatory to for the Russian regions to prepare the same documents. We even have these kind of notions in the new version of the tax code of Russia. So these main provisions, which are in our document, they have to be used by all constituent entities of the Russian Federation, and for some of them it will become mandatory to approve their version of this document with the Ministry of Finance. For others, it will be only of information for their information. But in any way, Russian regions will have to work on this kind of strategic document covering 3-year period. We believe it has to be mandatory. Thank you. Other questions, please? Right here we have a gentleman with a question. My question is for Konstantin about this group of national investors as Islamic countries. Do you have any ideas and considerations? Do you do anything about integrating the respective legislation to adapt it for the needs and the requirements of Islamic countries for attracting funds? You know, I would say that probably it is not among our first priorities. Yes, there is a notion of Islamic law, legislation, and specific requirements for the debt instruments that these countries are placing on any issuer or any borrower. And I think it's quite legitimate, and probably we can put such idea that yes, this kind of instruments can be issued. I am not completely sure, should it be a sovereign instruments or not. That's a matter for discussion. I am convinced that the effective legislation, the budgetary legislation, does not allow yet to issue this kind of financial instruments, but possibly we will go back to this topic, to this issue, sometime in the future, if we will see a demand by such pool of investors. We believe that this demand could be significant, or this demand and interest will be not necessarily about sovereign papers, but let's say corporate instruments. While the issue of this kind of sovereign instruments may be required as a certain benchmark for the revenue or yield levels or other financial parameters, then it would make sense again to elaborate on this issue. Any other questions, please, ladies and gentlemen? If not, maybe I will ask a question for Alexei Konstantinovich, and also the question for Konstantin. So basically, now the subfederal laws or municipal debts and budgets. For the last 2 years, their situation is getting better with collection of the debts. Debts is shrinking. The restructuring of the loans has made it easier on the poorest regions and the overburdened regions. And in the last years, some big market players, including the commercial market players, are cutting on the size of their outstanding debt, and the activity is very divergent. And my question for Konstantin is, what are innovations we can expect for the Russian regions in terms of them informing you about their debt policies? You've been speaking about more discipline for the market. We know it. What else can be expected by the regions, let's say, within the horizon 1 year or two? And my second question is to Alexei. How do you envision the market in terms of from the standpoint of the issue organizer, and what will be dynamics, of course, adjusting to external volatilities? I'll be very brief, with your permission. The key innovation we are expecting, and we've been speaking about several years now, would be an introduction of classification or ranging of all the regions of the constituent entities of Russia by their risk level, dividing them, breaking them down by 3 groups based on their risk level, and then assigning these categories or requirements for every region in each cluster or group. Let's say green, yellow, red group for the green zone, or there'll be the good financial stability and the good possibilities for attracting finances and borrowing money on the market. For the regions in the worst conditions, they will be faced with the requirement of approving their steps with the Ministry of Finance. They'll have to subject and approve their financial policy. And the group of regions which ended up in the worst group, they will have an instrument. On one hand, it's an instrument of the budget credit as an anti-crisis measure. On the other hand, there will be an imposition or introduction of the most stringent requirements, not only in debt policies, but also in stabilizing their budget policies and measures of getting out of crisis, and a number of other requirements. Basically, the draft document of changes in the budget code is public. It's available on our website. And with adoption of this legislation, I believe that the Russian regions will see some changes. Then can I ask one guiding question? How about the ratings? Credit ratings, will they be involved, or you'll be doing it on your own? Yes, they will be involved. Okay, thank you. And Alexei, how would you comment, and how do you see this situation? What do you think will be the market dynamics, and what will be the role of innovations? We, in our activities, do not propagate that subjects of the regions of the Russian Federations have to finance their budgets by issuing bonds. We do not recommend that. We believe that any finance ministry, they have to have a set of tools, and let's say bonds and loans. For some would be budget loans. So depending on the market situation on any given time, they have to make a decision either to be placed in or issuing bonds or attracting loans. The loan instrument is more slower and more like inertia kind of instrument. We can see the spike of the rates on the capital market, on the bond market. The loan rates are still catching up, and now there is a rare possibility to borrow money cheaper. But at the same time, we've witnessed on many occasions how the capital market would quickly restructure itself, and then how the credit market or loan market would catch it up very slowly. So we do not see any reasons to be concerned that there will be no bonds and the market bond will not exist. We believe that those difficulties we have right now, we believe they are temporary difficulties, and as soon as we'll have some windows of opportunities, the regions will have a chance to go out and to make placements. Of course, looking back at the credit market, if you'll be able to get money for lower rates than at the loan credit market, it will make sense. But the old-timers do remember that, and everything changes, but not that. As they say, there is nothing more constant than changes themselves. Opportunism in the best sense of the word. Maybe Alexei and Olga as representatives of regions with a better credit quality, and they have some objective data for that, of course. What is your perspective for the next year or 2 years in terms of financing public debt or issuing any instruments? Like I've mentioned, we are going to be attracting funds probably in the next year. And as for our portfolio structure, is that going to be loans or bonds, and what proportions, what breakdown, for what time frames? It's a question of monitoring the market. Now it would be difficult for me to be able to say what will happen in 2 or 3 months even. But the main parameters are more or less clear. We are placing the biggest bet on bonds, using the loans only for some short-term instrument for bridging our cash gap. But generally, we're going to follow the situation and see how it develops, and then adjusting ourselves based on what the market will be showing, taking into opinion our consultants' view. Olga, today we are pursuing the policy of decreasing our public debt. Then the revenue part of our budget enables us not to attract in the next several years, and hopefully this situation will keep up. In the next several years, we do not have to attract money. We can totally pay out our debt, and this is all that we do. Well, ladies and gentlemen, basically we've exhausted our agenda and time. Maybe Konstantin, as the host, will have the final say before we will move on. I would reiterate my admonition or my statement addressed to both representatives of banking circles and those from the Russian constituent territories. Be more proactive in discussing, debating, and interacting with the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation on the issues which we have touched upon today, because development of the best and optimal solution is only possible with the involvement of all the market participants. And these are the topics that we've been discussing today, and borrowings at the market of bonds and debt instruments for general public and population, guarantees, issues of guarantees and support. It all requires all wide range of opinions, so we are inviting you to active cooperation and dialogue. Thanks to all the participants, thanks to our audience. At this point, let's consider our panel closed. Thank you very much.